Here we are with a look at the news in East London, and today's programme is going to focus on housing, and in particular on the role of social landlords in Tower Hamlets, or more widely in East London. So you're very welcome to ring in and share your housing stories. Tell us what social landlords have done to you. We might even have a competition to see who suffered the most. But more of that later. At the moment, I'm going to introduce two guests. We have Councillor Marc Francis, who is councillor in Bow East, a Labour councillor. Marc, you and I have disagreed on most things to do with housing for the last 20 years, but I know we agree that the most important thing is that the tenants are happy and get a good service. And I also want to introduce, I see we've got a call coming in already. Hello, caller, who's calling?
Hello.
Hello, who's calling?
Hello, it's Kay. I've just seen on Twitter that you've got like some studio calling tonight about housing and Clarion. I'm on a train, so I'm not going to be able to talk for long, but
okay, I'm just going to hold you up 1 second and just introduce Suzanne, the secretary of SHAC, if we could see her on the screen as well. She'd like to listen to your call. She's very experienced in terms of campaigning. So, Kay, what's happened to you then? Where do you live?
Well, I live in Whitechapel, but I can't believe Marc Francis has got the audacity to come onto this because he was one of the reasons that Clarion was in Tower Hamlets.
Marc, that's an accusation for you. Kay, give us the detail. Are you there, Kay? No, it seems that Kay has left. So sorry for that, Marc. As you know, you were chair. Well, you remember being chair of housing. You remember the altercations that you and I had. But now we're going to focus on tenants who are suffering at the moment, who you have actually championed, and that's the tenants of Clare House. So if you'd like to tell us a bit, I think we've actually got another call coming in. No, possibly not. So let's get on to Clare House.
We can come back to Kay's point. I'm really happy to come back to Kay's point in a minute. So first of all,
just have to set the background for us.
Yeah, so just to say a little bit about what's happened at Clare House. So for those that live in Bow, that's the pink tower block, 20-storey tower block overlooking Victoria Park. It's the last of three. Two others were knocked down about 15 years ago by the Housing Action Trust, just before the transfer from the HAP to Old Ford Housing Association, as it was at the time. The third one was left up, that's Clare House, and it was renovated, and part of that renovation included cladding. So obviously, ever since the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower 4 years ago, residents in that block have been really concerned about the cladding on their block and also about some other issues. They've also long raised concerns about the quality of housing management and repair services by Clarion Housing. But what happened on the 29th of September was that Clarion went into the block and notified residents individually that they needed to be evacuated from the block. They said that needed to happen within the next 48 hours and that people would be put up into emergency accommodation.
What does it mean, Marc? Just to interrupt you, evacuated. Did they mean evacuated or did they mean evicted?
Well, I think that they meant evacuated, but obviously that's a massive shock, especially to residents that have lived there for their whole lives. At that stage, they told them that to pack, that as if they were just going to be going on holiday for a couple of weeks, but also told that they might not necessarily be coming back to the block, given the nature of given how dangerous it was. And they briefed us as they were sending the staff into the block to speak to residents.
Who asked Marc? Is that the ward councillor?
As local ward councillors, they briefed us. So that's the senior management team from Clarion told us that this was happening. And we've obviously been down and been speaking to residents a lot in relation to their experience, in relation to the emergency accommodation that they were being offered. And after quite a bit of wrangling, I think we did manage to get most of the residents into fairly reasonable, suitable emergency accommodation. So trying to avoid the kind of bottom end of the hotel market that maybe was the original intention, and into service departments, which at least gives people something that is akin to a self-contained flat, obviously not their home in any sense. But this
Okay,
has now
so
been
we've got
dragging on for more than 2 months.
how many tenants have we got in this emergency
Yeah, so
accommodation?
there's 122 residents in the block at the time. Sorry, 122 households in the block.
Yeah.
So probably something nearer to 300 residents in total. I think there's 15 leaseholders and about 107 tenants.
So let's bring Suzanne in here, because I know you've had contact with residents as well. Do they understand the situation? Are they, what's the word? Are they bearing up under the pressure of evacuation, or are there other problems?
Well, I think Marc is absolutely right in saying that it's been extremely traumatic for them. And I think there's also huge suspicion about exactly what is behind the decant, of tenants and residents from this block, because I mean, although they sort of notified people in September, there's no evidence presented that any new evidence had come to light that had prompted it. And I think, given that it is overlooking the lovely green Victoria Park in East London, a real priority site, I think there's a lot of tenants and residents who are deeply suspicious about whether actually what's going on here is just social cleansing. And I from our experiences in Shack, I think they're very right to be suspicious. There's no reason why Clarion shouldn't have just shared the information so that tenants and residents could actually see what the issues were. But they've been very, very reluctant to do that. I don't know if Marc has had more information, but certainly a lot of the tenants we spoke to.
Do you mean that they've been reluctant to release the reports they had on the condition of the block?
That's right, yeah. Well, that was the latest position, unless something else has come out recently, but that was the latest position that we were alerted to.
Marc, what do you know about this? I mean, has information been shared with yourselves or with the tenants?
So we've had the same information that residents themselves have had, which is a report from the structural engineers that were sent in, Arup, who are a very reputable company. And but that's a summary. It's a letter that was given by Arup to Clarion's senior management team, summarising their concerns. It mentions that there are a whole series of other documents so Arup was sent in to undertake a peer review of an earlier assessment. We haven't seen that assessment. We have seen, because residents got it themselves, somehow a copy of the fire risk assessment that was carried out at Clare House earlier on this year, which doesn't mention anything about the problems there. And Arup, I think, rightly identifies some potential structural problems with this block. It's a large panel system block, and they were never designed to stay up forever. And there's certainly where we have others of those. Well, so in other parts of the country, those blocks have been brought down. As I said, 2 of those in Bow were already brought down. And I think that there's a kind of an expectation, really, that there is very likely to be some serious structural issues with the block. But it's really the combination of the structural weakness with the cladding. And that is where this problem lies. And as I said at the start,
it's hard to pinpoint it in terms of the documentation, because so much of it has been kept secret. Does anybody know why it's being kept secret? I mean, it's not, it's not commercially sensitive in the sense that nobody's going to come along and say, "Oh, there's a tower block, I think I'll buy it."
I mean, I think it is potentially commercially confidential because of the decisions that Clarion has taken on the back of a whole series of reports that it's commissioned since. And frankly, it will be very damaging. I think it's likely to show that that Clarion has been aware both of the structural weakness and the issue of how flammable there's polystyrene in between the cladding and the outer skin, the original outer skin of the building, and this is going to be a massive issue for
what right Marc puts polystyrene on the outside of a building?
I can't speak to the decisions that were taken. in the way that this building was clad. I mean, obviously there is much wider debate about why regulations were allowed to become so inadequate that that these kind of things were done in terms of the cladding. But I want us to just to focus on the reports themselves. Yeah. So so as I said at the start, the day after the fire at Grenfell Tower, there was a fire at Clare House on the ground floor, and residents themselves raised concerns about the cladding at that stage with Clarion. And we know that fire risk assessments were undertaken in all of the tower blocks by all of the social landlords in Tower Hamlets. But what residents were told was that there was no problem here. There's nothing to see. They just needed improved fire doors, and that would improve the situation, and to remove kind of clutter from the hallways and
as you probably heard there, we have another caller on the line, so let's just interrupt you again, Mark. Hello, caller. What's your name?
No, it's Kay again. I said to you I was on a train. I was willing to call back if you was willing to take the call.
Yes.
Marc has a long history with Clarion, which used to be in our borough called Old Housing, until they merged. Don't get me started on one housing, which I think used to be called East End Homes. Ever since they pushed people and threatened people, and I was there because they tried to take over my estate barrier. If you didn't go over to the housing association, you were getting no repairs done. You were getting nothing done. That was what's told to us in the meeting.
Kate, it's a very wide set of allegations. I suspect, I suspect that the things you've said about the various housing associations probably have a foundation in truth. But where do you live, Kate? Are you part of Clarion? Are you a tenant of Clarion?
I'm not in Clarion, thankfully. They are a terror group.
Okay, so you're laying into Mark Francis.
They tried to get hold of my old estate. We campaigned against them because they tried to get hold of my old estate.
So you were saying before that Mark...
All my friends that are under them, the minute literally that they took over, your charges skyrocketed. So if you were unfortunate and you was unemployed, that wasn't covered by benefits. Your rent skyrocketed, no repairs have been done. I know a leaseholder who's really ill under Clarion. Leaks from people above, nothing's been done. And I've had to step in and help this person. Okay,
so basically you're saying that the tenants of Clarion get a raw deal, and you think that Mark has...
Raw is the tip of the iceberg.
No, I appreciate...
Raw is the politest way that you can put it. People were told to leave the council and go over to these housing associations. They were told it's going to be so much better, we're going to be amazing, we're going to get new kitchens and bathrooms, your repairs will be done quicker. We are literally God's gift to housing. Literally within 6 months to a year, it was hell on earth. And it's just got worse and worse over the years. So if they can't handle the stock, give it back. If you can't, stop the merging. If one housing can't cope with their stock, instead of merging with Riverside, allegedly, give it back to Tower Hamlets and whatever other council you took it from.
Well, I'm a one housing resident, and the merger with Riverside took place a week ago, so it's a bit late on that score. But before we come back to Mark, who I'll give him a chance to reply in a minute, Suzanne, have you had you've had contact with Clarion residents? Have you had similar experiences to the anger that Kay is expressing?
Yeah, and it's driven really, I mean, actually Kay expressed it very, very well about the pattern that has just been repeated up and down the countries with this wholesale handover of stock from councils to housing associations with and actually this is a sector that is almost unregulated. It is almost unaccountable. Really, unless you're talking about the very small associations where there is an ability to put pressure on them. But one of the things that Kay highlighted was the fact that they've gone through these big series of mergers, one after another, and they've become massive landlords. I mean, Clarion's got something like 110,000 units. So they're huge organisations. supported with government funding, but with very, very few strings attached to it. So they really are unregulated. The powers of the regulator have been cut back. You know, every time there's a new housing act, it takes away more power from the regulator, which is very deliberate. That's no accident. And the same with the ombudsman. You know, the ombudsman has very little power. The ombudsman may be making when you count your turnover as 253 million, to get a fine of £100 is really not going to make much of a dent, is it?
Oh dear.
So you know, the powers to bring these organisations to account, and there's no tenant and resident democracy.
So I really agree with that point, Jenny. Can I just respond, just to follow up on that point? So look, ever since 2010, when the coalition government came in, it abolished what was the Tenant Services Authority. And as you know from your experience on as a resident of One Housing and across your neighbours on the Isle of Dogs, that at that stage, the Tenant Services Authority was beginning to bite on some of the bigger social landlords as well. It was far from perfect, but it had powers, and more than that, it had the intent to try to stand up more for residents of all social landlords, and it was beginning to do quite a good job. But as soon as the coalition government came in, it swept that away, chucked it on its bonfire of the quangos, and replaced it with self-regulation. In other words, the housing association movements were left to control themselves. And you know, if the leadership of the housing association movement would have stayed the same, if the people working for those organizations would have stayed the same, there's a chance that self-regulation could have worked. And in fact, for some of the smaller housing associations, you can kind of say it does work. But with the big players, suddenly, and the drive for commercial development, to get involved in commercial development, all of their attention were moved in that direction towards building new homes, and very little attention was paid to managing their existing stock. And that's really been at the root of this whole catastrophe. And it's not just Kay is quite right to say that it's about other housing associations, many other housing associations and councils as well. ITV News, which has been covering these stories brilliantly for the last 12 months, has shown that there are local authorities that are failing their tenants and leaseholders as well. So I don't think it's necessarily just about structure, but it's absolutely about accountability. In all of these big housing associations, you will very, very rarely find a tenant or a leaseholder on the board of governance of these organizations. And that's a conscious decision for them, the senior people that are running these organizations, to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to what their tenants are experiencing daily. And, you know, Kay rightly holds me to account for having supported the transfer, not to Clarion, but to Old Ford, the community-based housing association that preceded this. But we have to accept that old organizations like Old Ford had residents at the heart of their governance. These big players have no residents anywhere near their governance, and they're certainly not listening to tenants, which is why it's come down to a situation where ITV News is doing a better job of regulating and holding these organizations to account than the actual regulator or the government to bring them into it as well.
Well, thank you for that answer, Mark. So, okay, I know that won't make you happy, and we do appreciate your passion about the situation that residents are in. I can match you with that passion, but there's got to come a point where we've got to really examine.
I didn't really hear an awful lot of it. I heard him say something about structure. It's not always about structure. Absolutely, it's about structure. I've never heard such tosh and nonsense in my life. Where's my local housing office as a council tenant, not a social tenant? I've got a secure council tenancy. I'm not an assured rights paper tenancy, which everyone gave up when they were forced to transfer over. And when I say forced, should we go and re-look at all the ballots? And John Biggs and everyone was all involved with it. Everyone knows, all the councillors that are there, David, the head of housing, he was all there. I was there at the campaign. So I can't sit, and it's not an allegation if I'm there. The structure is everything. Ask the tenants where their housing office is. Their headquarters is like the north of England.
Yeah, that's right. Liverpool in my case, which is quite away from the Isle of Dogs. And I must say, actually, I've been to Liverpool and it's very nice, but it wasn't quite the place I thought I was going to have my landlord based in. Kate, thank you for your views. They are appreciated. Tonight we are concentrating a bit more on Clare House and one or two other social landlords in Tower Hamlets. So I do appreciate your view. We'll have another show shortly when we will talk about the stock transfer process and how tenants feel about it as a whole. But thank you. I think it's a salutary reminder to all of us just how strong the feeling is on the ground. Just going back to Clare House, Marc, perhaps do you know what the tenants are doing now? Now they've been spread out, is there a way that they're actually keeping together and having a common voice?
Well, there's very little good that's come out of this so far, but the fact that I've been meeting residents informally, you know, they get together collectively prior to Grenfell Tower, the fire at Grenfell, but especially since then. But the good thing is that residents have now formed a tenant and residents association so they've got their representatives meeting the Member of Parliament, meeting the Mayor, and also meeting Clarion directly to put their point of view across, which is really, really valuable. But as I say, there are 122 households which have now been which have now lost their home. There's a couple of people still in Clare House. But most everybody is out now. So the really difficult thing is that we had an expectation. We know that Clarion has empty properties within Tower Hamlets and outside of Tower Hamlets, and we had an expectation that they would move to be offering people permanent homes before Christmas. And it seems increasingly unlikely that that's going to be something that actually happens, which means that people are going to spend the whole of the festive season, 2 months leading up to December, whole of the festive season in temporary accommodation, and probably towards the end of January as well. And even then, what Clarion is saying is that they're only going to be offering people longer term temporary accommodation as well. And one of the really worrying things that we just found out a week or so ago is that what they want people to do on moving into that longer term temporary accommodation is to give up their existing secure or assured tenancy, which I have to say is a deeply, deeply worrying move for a housing association to make. So they might be able to make an argument legally that this is a necessity, but I think if you're a tenant of theirs that's just been through the experience that they have, on the back of the experience that you have with housing management and repairs services in this block, you are going to be very, very reluctant to give up your secure or assured tenancy in return for a 6 month assured short hold or even a 12-month one.
I can't see how Clarion dare attempt that. I mean, the tenants were nominated by Tower Hamlets. Who's Clarion to take away from them, a tenancy?
Yeah, I think that's why the language that they've used is that people should give this up in return for something else, and they also say a letter with a legally binding undertaking. But you know, I think people are going to want a lot more than that, and I totally understand why they do. You know, like people need to preserve all of the rights that they have, plus they need to be able to challenge the organisation legally as well for the offers of permanent accommodation.
Well, you don't get mortgage
this is why,
you don't get a mortgage company coming along and saying, "Oh, you think you own this house, but actually we decided to take it back," or anything like that. You know, so I think it's well. Just, and then Marc has to go in a second, so I just have to ask him a last question before we have a bit more time with Suzanne. What are you going to do about it, Marc? And do you think the council can put any influence on anybody?
So Jenny, for when I was a cabinet member for housing, we tried to challenge the housing associations, and we tried to G up the regulator and the government to do something about it. As I say, that the powers are significantly diminished, but they are not without power. So 5 years ago, we had issues with Clarion's predecessor called Circle Housing, and that organisation was utterly failing to provide people with heating and hot water, so like leaving them for weeks and sometimes months without carrying out repairs to those essential vital services. And I've made several complaints to the regulator about Circle and Clarion, and this was one of them. And the regulator was like, no, there's nothing to see here. This is just, there are just some difficulties, some teething problems with the new contractor. They actually had 3 previous contractors as well. The problem was very clearly Circle itself, and less so the contractors. And the regulator was like, no, we're not doing anything about this. And our Member of Parliament, Rishanara Ali, then raised this issue in Parliament. She got a debate on Clarion service and the regulator's oversight of this service. And within 24 hours, we had a meeting with the regulator, with the chair of the regulatory committee as well. So the people who have governance oversight of the senior management team at the regulator. And about a week or so later, this organisation, Cllr, was downgraded. So it is possible, even with the much diminished regulatory powers and standards that the regulator currently has, and they're due to be improved. I should say that they're due to be strengthened a little bit in the coming months, I think. But there is the possibility that this organisation can be held to account. So we're working with our Member of Parliament, Rishanara. We're working with our Mayor, John Biggs, as well, to try to increase the pressure on the organisation to deliver. So, you know, most of all, I don't want this to be a slanging match between us and Clarion. You know, we can save that for another day. The most important thing is that people have got to be moved speedily into permanent accommodation. I have constituents who've lived in this block for nearly 50 years. After having spent the previous 40 years living in Bow as well, their whole life in Bow. At the moment, we can't get Clarion to commit that they will be made an offer of a permanent accommodation in Bow. We can't get Clarion to agree not to go down this route of assured short-hold tenancies, temporary tenancies. And we also need to make sure that that the overcrowded families are rehoused in somewhere that's big enough and suitable for their needs in a reasonable time frame. People can't be left in temporary accommodation for, you know, for a year or so, which is, I think, what we all know what's happened in some other similar circumstances. So there's a lot more that we need to do to increase the pressure. We're trying to do that. We're trying to work with individual households as well to make sure that their needs are fully understood and that they're able to bid and have priority for bidding for alternative housing. Because one thing I should say is that this experience has been the camel that's broken the straw, the straw that's broken the camel's back for many tenants who are just utterly fed up with this housing association and want to leave. The difficulty they've got is that there's a lot of others that are operating in town hamlets that are pretty much as bad, and we need to make sure that there's somewhere decent for them to move to.
I hope, you know, it really does blight your whole life when your housing isn't secure. And it's not just sort of access to your local support network. I presume you have a fair number of children living in the households in that tower block. And if they all have to change schools or travel miles to keep up their school, that's really going to be difficult. And
Jenny, it's massively disruptive. All of the local schools are reporting, like, the families, like they're supporting the families that they've got there and the children that they've got there, but it's massively disruptive, you know, like an hour or something to get into school, and, you know, like, means you are having to try to get your children ready so much earlier than you would otherwise do if you could just walk there. You know, similarly, the local GPs have been brilliant, and they've also started challenging Clarion directly as well. You know, as a community, we are trying to make sure that we challenge the organisation. I think it's fair to say there are some good people working in this organisation, people that want to do the right thing. Just corporately, collectively, that organisation is not functioning in a way that is in the tenants' best interests.
Well, Marc, I know you need to go at this point, so I'm just going to say thank you, and please come back and just say to local residents, look, Marc Francis is actually still your champion. Here he is. We've heard it firsthand. He's working to get a decent solution.
Well, we do. We always try, all of us, and as local councillors do our best. But yeah, this kind of thing, it really does bring home how much the kind of regulatory regime has been undermined in the last decade, and how we need to make sure that all the public authorities are working together to try to fix this problem.
Well, we're going to let you go and start that, carry on that work. So thank you very much, Marc.
All right. Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye now. And we're going to turn now to Suzanne. I mean, Marc does try, but I mean, is he right? That it's just the system that's broken? What do you think? You've got a lot of experience nationally, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, the housing model is broken, I think it's fair to say, in Britain. I think the whole housing model is broken. And I mean, he's absolving, obviously, Labour governments of this, but they didn't do anything to fix it when they were in power. And this has been going on for years. This is not new. That you've had this trajectory towards originally what was council housing was through the LSVTs, as you mentioned, was transferred to housing associations, which was really, and a lot of us said at the time, this is the thin end of the wedge to privatisation. One of the most recent pieces of changes in housing legislation allowed tenanted properties to be moved basically wholesale from housing associations to private landlords. And there might be protection for that first tenant and things like, there might be sort of little protections around it, but those will soon get whittled away. So this stock, which was built with using, you know, public funding, by the public's money, by the taxpayers' money, has all ended up, you know, basically in the hands of these big private landlords. And a lot of Labour councils were doing that. The Labour government didn't do anything to stop it when the Labour government was in. So it's really been governments of all persuasions who were equally to blame for you know, what's happened, really. And the model is now broken. You've got these very, very big unaccountable organisations. It's not even enough having one or two tenants on the board. What difference does that make? I mean, even if we do have housing associations that have got a couple of tenant or residents on the board, but they could be out, you know, they're outvoted on everything. You know, even if they were voting in the tenants and residents' interest, having a couple of them on a board of 13, 14 people is really not going to make a difference. You need to have
something that we came across in one housing group.
Exactly.
We used to have on the island, we used the 4 estates that were transferred, used to have a resident majority board, and that was very effective. And I dare say that's why they abolished it. And we would say, you know, that if you've got 1 or 2 tenants on your board, they are board members who happen to be tenants, unless they are organically linked to the tenant movement, like they're elected by a TRA or something. They are not tenant representatives.
Exactly.
So it's incidental.
And quite often, none of the details are given out. There's no way of contacting them. There's no way, and they don't have power, and they don't particularly necessarily want to be in contact with the tenants and residents. So, I mean, the model you were talking about, there was a very similar one that was a subsidiary of Peabody near me when I was living in London, community-based housing association. And again, Peabody took it over. It had excellent KPIs, you know, its standards were very, very high. Got taken over by Peabody. They left it alone for a few years, and then they just took it over completely and abolished that as a separate entity and just absorbed it into the mainstream Peabody. And the standards have gone down, you know, lowered to be in line with Peabody's, rather than Peabody coming up to the standard that this small kind of very, very locally connected housing association was able to achieve. So you are talking about very, very different models. And I think the other thing is, I mean, as we saw in Haringey, if you are not happy with what your local councillors are doing with your housing, you know, with your housing, and you are a council housing tenant, you can get them out of office. You get the chance. Again, it's, I mean, Marc is right. It's far from a perfect solution, but at least you've got the opportunity of voting them out. There is no way of voting out the chief executives and the board of a large house or of any housing association, as far as I'm aware. So, you know,
is there any mileage in other forms of protests? I mean, is that what tenants have to do now? Do they have to lobby, petition, make a spectacle?
All of the above. And interestingly, what we're seeing is a rise in rent and service charge strikes.
Oh.
So people withholding payments. So this is something that we now have a group dedicated to supporting people who are taking that action, because people are increasingly using it.
I mean, I must say that we can't advise tenants to do that because you do come up against a problem sometimes, which is that you can't enforce a contract by breaking another contract. So, you know, people have to be aware that if they don't pay their rent, there may be consequences other than just the landlord folding. So I think I would probably prefer other forms of action. But I hear what you're saying, and it is remarkable.
And they've been very successful. There's been a very big successful campaign against Bellway as a landlord. When they wanted to pay for remediation, and the tenant said, we'll pay our normal service charge, but we're not paying the remediation.
Yeah.
One housing group, there was a rent strike when one housing group tried to increase rents by 40%.
Was that?
Where
was that?
In Newham.
Oh, right. That's next door to us, and it's part of our area.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to get in touch with some residents from there and have them on and
let them say. I mean, we have people who are now campaigners in Shack who did that. But the tenant residents all got together and said, again, we'll pay our normal rent, but we are not paying a 40% increase, because they were all it was all key worker accommodation. And the landlord, as you say, had all of the legal powers on their side, but instead of using those legal powers, they caved into because it's a very effective tactic. Do want to use it. And you know, in some cases, people had their rents lowered, even lower than before. So,
tactics. They are innovative, aren't they? I know a leaseholder in one housing group had a battle with 750 leaseholders. Let one housing group take them to court for non-payment of service charges, and the barristers for one housing group battling in the court said that they were quite happy just to carry on taking the court to the tenants, the leaseholders, to appeal to a higher court, to reappeal or whatever, because the more they did that, the more money they got. And of course, who was paying the money to the barristers? It was the same leaseholders who had started the action. Which is a great disincentive to them to continue. They might be going back on the leasehold charges. They lost in the legal charges for the other side. Real conundrum.
I mean, these are all the different. So when you talk to kind of any establishment figure, they'll tell you, look, there's the regulator, there's the first tier tribunal, which is what you're talking about. There's the housing ombudsman. And yet, when you start to actually look at those in practice, it's not really offering tenants and residents any real protections or you know, access to justice. You know, and if you've got, you know, you were talking about, you know, sewage running down your walls. In one case, you were talking about another case earlier where there's sewage running down the walls. Saying, well, in 8 months' time, I'll get my case heard at tribunal, you know, and then I'll show them.
Yes.
You know, you're living in this sewage with your child. That's not a solution, is it? It's not a solution to that problem. So tenants are looking at how else can they actually force the landlord to pay attention, and particularly with things like extortionate service charges, like the remedial work for cladding. Once you've paid up, going to tribunal and trying to get it back, the incentive for the landlord to even engage with you and give you the information that you need is next to zero. You know, you've already paid the money. Why would they care? You know, it's so this is why tenants are starting to look, tenants and residents, much more. We've seen definitely, and you know, and all what we do, we don't tell people this is what you should do. This is, you know, it's up to people to decide. We give them information, what the risks are, what they can do, how to mitigate the risks, how to make sure that they're as safe as possible if they are taking that action, and how to collectivize it, because that's the other side, is actually collectivizing the issue, not trying to fight it on your own. It's very, very difficult to fight on your own against such a big, you know, landlord like that.
I must say, at this point, you know, if as we're drawing towards the end of the programme, put out another invite to people to phone the studio like Kay did at the beginning of the programme. I keep putting the wrong phone number out for us. It's 0208 12345 07. There's the number on the screen now. And, you know, in the last few minutes of the programme, people are very welcome to ring in and to share their horror stories. Made me smile when Marc said, was talking about Clarian's inability to provide heating and hot water for a period of time. One housing group managed to let my flat go for 18 days without a working toilet, which I thought was particularly innovative. So I'd certainly like to thank the very nearby Asda supermarket for having facilities that were publicly available. But there you go.
What a way to live! What a way to live!
It just destroys you after a while. It just makes it so hard to fight back. We've seen that with so many residents in Tower Hamlets, and I'm sure I'm sure we're not alone either. It just grinds you down to such an extent. We had 2 people who had to drop out of activity in our TRA because they both had heart conditions and just physically just could not stand the stress of it. Complaining any longer. It was too strenuous.
Yeah, so, it takes a huge toll on people, which I think is why Shack is taken off, is because people do have that. They've got that peer support.
Here we go. Have another caller come in. We'll talk about Shack in a second. Hello, caller. Who's on the line?
Hello, my name's Wendy, and I'm a Clarion tenant.
Hi, Wendy. Really pleased to hear from you. What's it been like for you?
Hi.
Hi, Wendy. What's it been like for you living? Have you been? Did you live in Clare House?
No, I don't live in Clare House.
But you live in other Clarion property.
I'm getting an echo here.
I'm so sorry. We'll try to do something about it, but tell us your story.
So I'm a Clarion tenant. And I have been on a partial rent strike since July.
And why is that?
Because I've been trying to get improvements made on my estate for the past 5 years, and going through the complaints procedure and customer services protocol doesn't work.
Yes, I'm getting a bit of a delay as well. I don't know if we can sort that out. It's very distracting, isn't it? So, have the problems just started since Clarion took over?
Well, Clarion inherited some of the issues, but they have been completely useless since they took over in actually fixing the improvements that we need on our estate. So, yeah, they haven't made any difference at all since they took over from Circle 33.
Do they listen?
They've been worse.
Do they listen to you at all?
No. The only time I've been able to get myself heard is by taking action, which is through the rent strike. And I wrote to Claire Miller and told her I was going on a rent strike and the reasons why. And since July, we've been toing and froing with letters and phone calls and emails on the particular issues that I raised initially in July. They keep on just coming back and forth with, can you remind us what we're supposed to be doing? The reasons why you have a complaint. It's just never-ending circular hamster wheel type of behaviour from Clarion, and I think the reason behind that is for me to give up, to get stressed out and feel that I don't want to deal with it anymore, which is a part of their game, I think.
Suzanne, do you want to comment on that? Do you think Wendy's right to fear that?
When you see what people are going through, it really is a war of attrition against tenants and residents. And Wendy's description about, just remind us, just tell us again. Can you just go through it all again? I mean, it's like if you go for any kind of medical procedure and you have to tell your symptoms over and over again to different doctors or something, you just end up worn down with it, don't you? I mean, we've maybe been through that experience in other walks of life. But I mean, what Wendy's talking about, and about, desperately trying to get hold of them, they've moved away from having neighbourhood managers. Almost all of the big housing associations have moved away from having neighbourhood managers who was local, who would know all the families on the estate, who would be able to pick up the phone and get a plumber in if a plumber was needed, or an electrician in if an electrician was needed. They could sort it out. But all of that moved to this much more efficient online call centre where nobody can deal with your issue. So it's really efficient from the housing association's perspective, because nobody actually picks it up, and it just, as Wendy said, it just goes round and round in circles. The people, and it's not the fault of the people answering the phone. They haven't got the power to do anything. They haven't got the power to organise a plumber or whoever needs to come in to do the work. So it is a very deliberate, and the associations know this. They know it isn't working for the tenants and residents. This is not some kind of accidental byproduct. It's
we wish you all the best, Wendy. Have you got anyone helping you? Are there other tenants doing this? Have you got a TRA?
No, we don't have a tenants residents association, but I am a member of SHAC, and SHAC have been brilliant in supporting me through the process of the partial rent strike and the strike group that we have. We meet regularly and we can talk things through and sort of keep each other in a sort of comrade supportive way, to even if we are the only person on our estate that is actually taking the action. And I'm actually beginning to see some of the improvements made that I've been requesting for the 5 years. I'm down to trying to get the last improvement made, which is one of the bigger improvements in installing security gates. And yeah, I've tried to get other tenants involved in helping me take action, but it's been very difficult because people have very stressful lives. Quite a lot of people in my block have personal issues, and they don't want to take on the landlord because they just feel very demoralised in the first place. So you have to be quite strong-willed to do this sort of thing, and to take, to become an activist. You've got to be in a position to be able to do that, and also people aren't, and I think they take advantage of that. Simple as that.
Well, it's been very good.
The Housing Association,
Thank you for coming on and sharing that story with us. And do keep in touch with East London News. And the telephone number you can see on screen, the one that you just rang, you can ring at any time to talk to. Sometimes if we're live on air, we can't always answer it, but you can always talk to us on that phone number, text us or whatever if something's happened. And I don't know if we've got the graphic handy, but you can also email me at eastlondonnews.gmail.com. That's the easy one to remember. And give me your phone number and I'll call you. And we'll keep the story alive in East London at least. So thank you very much for ringing, Wendy. More power to your elbow, and good luck with your battle. Suzanne, do you want to just tell us a little bit about what SHAC is then? Obviously, it's an organisation which has really helped an East London resident, but I know you're not living in London yourself. So what actually is SHAC? How long has it been going?
No, we've been going a couple of years now. It really came out of a network, a way of the housing workers, the United Housing Workers branch, networking with tenant and resident groups, but it really took off for exactly the reasons that have been covered in your show tonight. The lots of tenants and residents who have really struggled, and there wasn't any other organisation really providing support for them. It is a national organisation. All of our meetings at the moment are on Zoom anyway, but because these landlords are national, you could never hold them in one location anyway. You would, to allow tenants and residents to meet together. you would need to hold, we would need to use Zoom anyway. So it's kind of pushed people into doing something we would have wanted. So and we have specific groups for Clarion, Hyde, One Housing Group, Riverside, L&Q. So those are the ones that, and they meet regularly on a monthly basis. And they drive the campaigning. It's the tenants and residents themselves who drive the campaigning, decide what they want to do. We have a separate strike group to support the strikers, and also a disability visibility group, because there's a huge problem with discrimination against people with disabilities by social housing landlords. So, you could have a whole nother program on that one, Jenny. That's another big topic on its own. So that's what we do. And then we do have some open public meetings, and we hold protests and things like, so we do the sort of traditional stuff of protesting, and we are also building a sort of links with politicians now, and we're making representations to a committee on social housing regulation. So we are sort of trying to get these issues addressed strategically and politically, rather than just trying to fight case by case, really.
Well, it sounds like just the sort of organisation we need in East London. I'm sure we can keep you very busy. Sadly, as you sort of hinted, One Housing Group has now merged with Riverside as from the 1st of this month. So particularly on the Isle of Dogs, the housing association we thought was going to be tenant-led and very local has now, because of the actions of men in suits, I was going to say, I suppose that is really unfair, but just seems true. The actions of people who are paid a lot more than most of us are, let's say that. We're now being ruled from Liverpool, and Liverpool may not like it. We don't know it's very obscure, the whole process. And I think the turnout was certainly under 5% in the consultation. How can that happen? It's very difficult. So, and
the consultation came back with less than 50% favouring a merger with Riverside. I don't know. Have I got time to say one last thing about Riverside?
Yeah, do.
Because on our website you'll find the full story. But Riverside recently realised it had a problem with too many tenants bringing disrepair claims and costing, because they were settling out of court, which they would really only do if they thought they were going to lose.
Yes.
They projected it was going to run into the millions of pounds that it would cost them to settle out of court. So what they've done is set up, this came to us from leaked papers from their executive that were leaked to SHAC. What they've done is got together with a whole load of other housing associations. There's a group of 8 of them in a core group, but then a wider group around them, to lobby government to change the law to make disrepair claims less lucrative for the tenants and residents, even though they admit that legislation is there to protect tenants and residents from unscrupulous landlords. They obviously don't count themselves as an unscrupulous landlord, but nonetheless they want to change it because it's costing them too much money, rather than investing that money in actually just making the repairs in the first place so that people haven't got a claim. And this is the kind of mentality that we're dealing with, a shoot the messenger mentality, rather than actually address the problem.
Well, I mean, housing disrepair claims aren't lucrative for tenants who have to make them. They're a measure of last resort. And most of what you get out of a housing disrepair claim is, if you're lucky, you get your disrepair repaired, like it was supposed to be.
But this is the narrative that they're putting out. It's all these no win, no fee lawyers are coming and tempting all these tenants and residents. But these people have got legitimate claims, and they just want to make it harder and harder to get to court. So
I could say a lot about that, but I'll just take one interesting point, which is at the resident consultation in East London. I went to, I think, just about every consultation meeting in E14. One Saturday we had 3 in a row, and I just kept turning up at them. Hello, me again, which is great. But one of the very senior officials from One Housing Group who'd come along to persuade residents or to answer residents' questions said, one of the reasons why we are merging with Riverside is because when you have a larger housing association, it's easier to lobby government and you can be more influential. None of us had any idea this is what Riverside wanted to lobby government about. So that's
very revealing. Very revealing. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also revealing to hear that they have problems doing their own repairs, because the other reason that a senior official in one housing group told us, who worked in the finance department, I can't say that he was finance director or whatever, but somebody of that nature, was that, I don't know who it was the top man, it was the managing director. He came to a meeting with one of our groups and explained that one housing group was having financial difficulties. It had a lot of fire safety work to do. It had problems maintaining its social care group. It needed to play its part in building new housing. And there was a fourth reason, but there were 4 costly things. And it was merging with Riverside because Riverside had some spare cash and could invest in the whole properties. In other words, you know, the people from Liverpool, poor tenants from Liverpool, would be paying to declad our tower block, as it were.
I mean, in fact, the Riverside, the merger is a rescue job. In fact, because one housing group went from a 12 million plus a surplus to a minus 8 million deficit. So one housing group is in financial difficulty, but rather than actually come out and announce that this is a rescue job, they've kind of hidden that and tried to hide it behind all of these factors that one housing group is talking about. They've affected all housing associations. They're not unique to one housing group, but other housing associations have not ended up in deficit. It's bad investment decisions that have led to the financial woes. But all the top people are still there. You know, all the top people are still in charge, still drawing big salaries, not taking responsibility for what's happened. The board isn't taking responsibility for either the financial problems or the fact that they're now having to be rescued by another housing association in Liverpool. You know, they write their own narrative, don't they?
Well, I could carry on discussing this all night, and I'm sure you could, at least for a long while yet. But I think that's probably it for tonight. I've got one other thing I'd like to say, but for the moment, we are going to keep in touch with you, Susanna. We have your contact details now, and so we certainly will. And so I hope we get more housing articles in East London News and more snippets of housing information here, because clearly we have touched a vein, and that is something of great concern to people. So if you've been watching this programme and you've enjoyed it, please share the link with your fellow housing activists or your fellow residents. So for the meantime, Suzanne, thank you very much for coming on, and I hope we'll be in touch and see you again. So thank you for that. Good night. And just one more thing to say to our other viewers. We've had anybody having trouble with their shopping? This is a story that we're looking into. We've had an example where one of the major supermarkets has a delivery service, but East London residents have been having problems actually booking delivery slots. Not because there aren't any, but because when they click on the delivery slot they want, a message comes up saying, "Sorry about our technical difficulties, could you try later?" At the moment, this has been going on for at least a week, which makes it very difficult for people who are trying to get their shopping delivered. So we'd love to hear from you. If you are in that boat, we'd like to see how big this problem actually is. So if you are experiencing difficulties getting a delivery slot booked, if your supermarket isn't doing its job, could you please let us know? We have, do contact East London News. It's eastlondonnews.gmail.com. I'm not sure we have the graphic to hand at the moment, but it's simple to remember, eastlondonnews.gmail.com. Give us an email and let us know. So for that, it's good night for this evening, and we'll see you next Tuesday with another edition of the Tuesday Show. Thank you for watching, and good night.